in the future I'm going to put together a white paper. In fact, you might remember in the ad for this event, I said I was going to give a presentation, but the exhaustion of getting this done didn't allow me to get a formal presentation together, unfortunately. But I'm very serious about this concept, which I would like to field some questions if anyone has any. But let me just say generally that there have been counter-market ideas that have gone on for years in the form of time banks and sharing networks. In the general Zeitgeist community, there have been tool libraries and other things of that nature. And they go back a long way. There's like 100 years of people that have tried to do alternative currencies using non-transferable, non-Ponzi asset type things, such as credits, as opposed to exchange systems, monetary exchange systems that you give credits to somebody else and it changes in value based on floating currencies or things like that, which is of course a problem. So this kind of idea is the new seed that I'm trying to plant, and I hope to see some development with it. Whether it exists in a kind of gesture that others can build upon, or whether enough people come together, which of course is the ultimate goal, to try and build this kind of infrastructure. The latter would be ideal. Now, I've been very much burnt out over the past 15 years, just trying to think about what can be done. The kind of structure that needs to be created to make something like that happen would require enormous resources, but it could be done in small scale. And I'm kind of ahead of myself right now because I'm trying to explain something. I'm sort of making an assumption about what everyone knows. So I think it might be best to field some questions in regard to that or anything in regard to the film. And I'll just say one more thing in conclusion, though. There's some rough edges in that thing that I really want to take care of. That maybe I'm overcritical, but I appreciate your patience. There's some resolution issues in there. It's an archival piece, so it's really hard to sometimes get footage, the authentic footage from archivalists and sources, and you have to kind of work with what you can. So leave it at that. And what we'll do is, we don't just want to walk up this way, and she's going to hold the microphone here. So this will be easier, because if I start pointing to people, I'm going to get lost. So we'll just form a line over here, if you wouldn't mind. So anyone that wants to ask questions, come form a line, and we'll do it that way. Thank you, I appreciate everyone's patience with that. Because if I start pointing, for one, I can barely see anybody. And I'll start pointing to the same people. And the last time I did this, I think I pointed to the same guy. I called on like 4 times, and I didn't realize it was the same person in neglect of all the other people who had questions.
Hi. How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm well. Greetings, everyone. My name is Cassandra. First of all, thank you so much. This was really good. I was taking notes like a crazy person in my phone without trying to disrupt anybody's eyesight. So the question that I have, so I've been watching these movies since day one, and showing them to others. And the question that I have, even when we're talking about future visioning, and in particular with your movies, which I think are extremely well produced, very well made, extremely informative, so important. But what I find frustrating overall is the absence of women anywhere in the scenario, not as kind of side notes or footnotes in history, but how women have impacted the outcomes of some of these things that you raise in these documentaries. And I think the reason I'm raising it, it's not a criticism as much as it is an acknowledgement about the role that women have to play as central to what the future looks like. And I am a documentary junkie, right? An information consumer. But the other thing I am is a spiritual woman who has children and grandchildren. And no matter how far along we move, no matter how many gains we make, it's always presented as if half the human population, which is female, have not played any major contributory roles ongoing. Not as this extraordinary one woman who did this thing, or this extraordinary one woman who did this thing.
Let me say this. I would hope that the implication of all of the works, and even the book I wrote, which is called The New Human Rights Movement, which is about the entire dichotomy of all of this imbalance in society, whether it's race, whether it's gender, those things are touched upon. Its focus is more on economic imbalances, and that's honestly where I think most of this stuff is rooted. There's such a deep economic imbalance that it's fomented this kind of general sexist bias and general racist and group bias is rooted more economically, and when it comes to women, on many different levels, because the perception of women, in the household, they can't contribute to the economy, and then when they did, they were kind of absorbed into the system to perform the same acts of men, so to speak. You know what I'm trying to say? Imitate the behavior of the general business community. It wasn't the effect, I think, in the spiritual sense that I think you're getting at, how to put it, but the sensibility of women different from men, which I think, would you agree with that, that there's a certain touch to women that's different from men, which could be cultural or biological. I'm saying that because this is what the people have talked about historically numerous times, which is why I think it's an important distinction. Excuse my rambling, but all the work that I've done is about finding equality between everyone and shutting down the groups. And I think making sure that we actually not get too hung up on any group that has been suffering historically and trying to find, I'm not saying that you are, but that's my core theme, is that if we just get a hold of this general dividing system of economics, these things will resolve themselves and a whole new level of respect will be born.
And I get that, I understand that, but there is a book that I would encourage everybody to read called The Great Cosmic Mother, Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth. And while it may sound like, some hippie shit, it is extraordinary in helping us to understand the whole of human history and the role that women have played. And the reason I want to mention it, it's the last thing I'll say. I swear, 2 seconds. One thing that she says in this chapter called The Machine, which is kind of closer to the end of the book, is that one of the failures of socialism has been that inherently all socialist organizations and revolutionary movements have still been male-centric. And the problem with that is that the original, assaults on human beings, this thing that we find ourselves a part of, had its original purpose as controlling the reproductive labor of women first. Women produce the working class. Women produce all living organisms that contribute to the machine.
Sure.
The original worker, or the original laborer, was the female, and then as a consequence of that, you have this class of people who are chronically exploited by the control of labor itself.
Okay, well, we can't have too much, we have to move on to other people, but I appreciate your comment, and I would say that there's such a need to focus on those that have suffered and have been shortchanged and abused, and women certainly have been for a long, long time. But it's also good, as in the broadest scheme of things, which I always try to return to, is that we can't get too caught up in forming a sort of group bias within itself, where we become too centric in trying to bring attention to something that really is the result of the oppression of others. The example I often use in terms of race is that it's a concoction. It's not something that's real. We invented it. The superior class, the ownership class, you call it white or whatever, but it's really this type of class of organization invented the need to exploit people, and the use of race was a way to do that. Then they created it because in America, race is a legal distinction. It didn't exist before abject slavery was brought during the slave trade. And after that is when the idea of someone being black and someone being white was invented. And that's just something we have to always keep in mind when we talk about these things, is to always remember that we can't continue the division by trying to bring attention to something in the sense that it's implied as separate. So I like to think of men and women as fundamentally the same, and I think the actual rise of the fact that you have gender blurring, this kind of new consciousness where someone can be born as a man, but they very much might be a woman in their mind, or whatever language someone wants to use. That's a very positive thing. I see that in the same way that people that are locked into their race identity tend to feel divided in that way. You just have to blur it all. It's all blurrable, and I'm for blurring literally all of it, because it doesn't help anything to keep these divisions going. Next.
Peter, thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thanks for tonight. More than a decade ago, you have changed the course of my coming of age, and I owe you a debt of gratitude for your work. And it turns out, more than 10 years later, your brother Eric did the same with his work.
Nice.
So it's a special night for me tonight.
Awesome. Yeah.
Your extraordinary work will suffer the fate of Salvador Allende.
Well, see, That's why it's brought up. It's not to interrupt you, but the goal is to avoid that. And that's why.
And so will your intercollective.
See, but I can articulate the reasons why that structure is the way it is.
Unless.
Okay, I'm sorry, finish your point.
Unless we as a species go through an inner transformation.
Okay.
None of this will come to pass if we don't transform. What is your plan B? What's your counterpart to that transformation?
The plan B counterpart to which transformation?
This extraordinary genius plan that you have outlined.
Everyone has to have an interest to want to be part of something for the reasons that they share, right? So if someone wants to come into a community that wants to get off the grid of the market, they obviously have to have a value system to begin with, or they see certain merits that benefit them, and they might not necessarily agree with the theory or the philosophy behind all this, but they might not have the kind of work that they need. In the integral structure, you could have people that are kind of alienated from the system, people that have disabilities, they don't have jobs, they don't have access to the normal market resources. In this kind of time bank structure, which is why I was inspired by it, there are all sorts of people that really can't work in the traditional economy, but they can work in this kind of system. There's a different set of values with a different set of needs. As far as the inner revolution, I would kind of argue with you that that kind of 60s concept of the inner awakening, and that we have a lot of spiritual people that talk about this is all an internal problem. I've run into this quite a bit. I really believe that that's more of there's a divide between that, and I think the environment actually is far more powerful in shaping people's values than their own internal capacity. There might be resources for people to change their own values. People can talk about meditation, all sorts of things like that. But I think people are fundamentally and immutably an environment of what their conditioning, their parents, their social system, they can't really be out of it. They only know what they know, right? So it takes that kind of input. I think this would actually condition people once they see others actually doing something that counter, more sustainable kind of revolution, with a more sustainable economy, I should say, that could move towards a revolution. I think it could move very quickly to change values. Once they realize they're not harming the planet, once they realize they're not exploiting each other, I think those values are there with all of us because we do sense that. We see what's happening in the environment, the destruction of it, and we don't want to see other people harmed, most of us. Most of us don't have that superiority complex, so we just sort of fall into those lines because the system demands we be competitive in that way to be successful, and so on and so on and so on. So I think you have to create the conditioning first. If that makes sense. I think the conditioning comes first. And thank you, I appreciate it.
Joseph, I just wanted to start off with thank you for changing my consciousness and moving.
I want to say that, but
yes, as you do. You know.
Thank you, appreciate that.
You know, you hear it all the time for good reason. So there's two main points I'm curious to get your thoughts on. But for the context of here, two for now. So the first question is in regards to just praxis, because your ideals have always been in many ways ahead of their time and beyond what the current paradigm has been able to wrap its head around. But to get to where we go, just to kind of put on your historian's hat, the way things unfold is usually through power struggles and oftentimes battles won and major fights and so on, as you know, right? The dialectic of history.
Right.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are in regards to where we are now, the cauldron of, let's say, a lot of difficult times that might be coming ahead geopolitically and internally.
Right.
And then how that can kind of alchemically lead to the rising world that you see and how that can happen culturally.
I used to,
I have one, I think the second part.
we have
All right, let's do one and the other.
I think there's it's almost a cliche to say things have to break down for change to occur. But I tend to find that even though that does happen, there will be an imbalance, an instability that can ferment new things. That's certainly a pattern. But I think when it comes to the dominant patterns, like for example, in the environmental crisis, which continues on many different levels, all life support systems continue to be in decline. And if you were to go back, say, 70 years, and you explain where we are now in terms of all the crises, people would say, well, we'll change before that happens. But no, it's a slow grind of people slowly adapting. Like what will happen is you'll have, let's say poverty. Like at some point, Los Angeles probably wasn't riddled with 80,000 homeless people. And maybe someone saw one, like, oh, let's try to help this one person. And slowly they became conditioned to see more and more. And suddenly that's just the nature of it. They don't even think about it. And I think that's what is more probable, cynically speaking. I really don't think people will just snap out of it as fast as a lot of people assume. So yeah.
Well, just a real quick response to that, I'll just say that at the end of the day, for that to be implemented, somebody with some kind of monopoly of force over constitution or over some kind of force to be able to enforce the implementation of this would at least have to defend itself against detractors that might try to take it down at some level, just in terms of realistically.
I think the beauty of, given the history of infiltration and destruction of numerous social movements throughout history, which is just constant. I mean, IMB is the greatest example. I mean, he's not even rare. I mean, when you go into all this social movements historically, even spooky things I've dealt with in my own social activism, you know, engaging the movement, there's a sabotage, whether it kind of happens organically or it happens from external forces. The goal is to build that into the system. So I can't sit here and explain how that would happen, but it's the cognizance of it. I think with this kind of system, if you kind of understood what was explained, it's a voluntary system that already is actually existing. It's been around for 100 years. The concept of the time bank, the concept of sharing networks. The difference is you integrate them all together, and then you have other levels of this CAD system that I talked about, which actually starts to override the very process of entrepreneurialism, effectively, of the market economy. And to say that as an aside, people ask, well, how would that happen? Once you have people building those designs, you start to take resources and you start to find buildings and structures and land. You have to use money for that initially, but once they're established, and once the efficiency movement, once the interest to not exploit scarcity in these new structures, I would say producing something like, I don't know, say arbitrarily furniture. So you'll have a co-op that's built into the system, and they're working to be as efficient as possible without any of the influences of money, because they've taken care of that, for reasons as far as taxation and stuff that goes from different places. But they're able to do that, they're able to create more efficiency, and they're able to do it in a way that there's nothing that anyone can complain about, because it's not actually there to do anything like what Allende was doing, where it's extracting, like expropriation. The whole conspiracy against him was that these companies want to maintain their dominance in this country. It's very hard to have that same kind of thing. It can happen, but I think this would be a much more defensive posture. And if enough people use it, it's not the kind of thing that can be shut down like that. They can't just overthrow somebody. Everyone's still in the network and in the system. So maybe someone does something to try and, you know, mess up the system or take the programming down or crash it. There'd be redundancy and things like that. It's a long conversation, but I gave that a lot of thought. How do you stop that type of interference? And I think something like this is more probable than most social movement concepts that we see. We're all do now. The only way you bring down a social movement is you find a figurehead and you attack them. And at some point, it creates alienation. This kind of thing doesn't have a figurehead. It's just a community of people that do something. There's no faces. That's a very important point.
Inspired by ripple effect.
What's that?
Inspired by ripple effect.
Yeah, sure.
I just want to quickly second because a little bit.
Yeah.
I just want to put one more thing. I just wanted to say that I have a sense that economic optimization is necessary, but not sufficient for the kind of cultural milieu that will optimize kind of mass psychology. Because if you look at what rationalism and empiricism did, it killed old bad religions, but in a way threw the baby out with the bathwater, because old tribal traditions and old religions gave us things like rites of passage and communal aspects of related to the spiritual. And now we've kind of come to this nihilistic, death hole where we're, sedated in front of screens. And I'm just wondering, even if we were to have economic abundance, if people aren't mentally healthy, don't have that sociological optimization, we still need to have that culturally, and I'm just wondering what your view is on how that void can be filled at a non-material level, at a spiritual level.
I'm not sure I completely understand what you mean. I mean, the cultural thing, I think, happens on its own as the values come to fruition, if I understood your point correctly. The hedonic adaptation that I mentioned is a really important point, though, when you use the word abundance, because abundance can only be relative to an acceptable, sustainable, arranged sense of arrangement. You can't just think that people will have more and more and more. And there has to be an actual relationship to the way people live and the sustainability of the planet, which you could calculate if you really wanted to, based on where we are now with the fruits of technology and ephemeralization, because we're constantly doing more and more with less and less. hence the, not to go on a tangent here, but hence the kind of arithmetic view that people have. They say, well, population has done this, that means if you want to reduce resources, you got to reduce population. That's actually not true. That's one of the propaganda arguments out there. If you really embrace the more with less phenomenon, I talked about this before, criminalization, you will have an increase of material abundance, you can have an increase in population, and you don't actually have an increase in the use of resources. That's the greatest wealth that we have in economics. That's what wealth, in fact, means. It's really sad that no one thinks that way, because, seriously, how many times have you heard someone talk about sustainability and all these points brought up here, and they instantly think you're going to be a draconian, imposition, and people will have their birth controlled and all that stuff. They're missing the entire point of the undercurrent of what actual sustainable wealth creation means. So anyway, sorry about that tangent, please.
Happy to hear thanks for your work as well.
I know you.
Yeah. You?
I think I met you before. Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, I didn't really.
I recognize it.
I didn't really have a pre-planned question, but I guess this is something I was kind of struggling with. I guess you mentioned in the film something you were saying there, like I guess a lot of folks wasn't. I think a lot of people think that there's a focus on secret societies or some external force. I feel like there's a lot of people could figure out a way to make it work, but it seems like there's always some force. For example, like Martin Luther King, I guess he was killed, like JFK before we killed him. But I feel like people do want to come together and make things work, but it just seems like there is some force.
Of course.
That kind of wants to keep everyone divided and things not work out.
It is a system force, because the culture that's created, a culture of power that's fostered, as that third section explained, there's something that's happening. It's a very loose description, because obviously this is more complicated than that, but there's a cultural phenomenon. It's like that George Carlin clip. They don't have to get together and conspire. They know what their shared needs are, what's good for them. I think that's the most important point. I'm not dismissing the fact that there are literal criminal power centers, and there's a conspiracy that happens every moment of our lives. There are people, history is fundamentally conspiratorial. That's happening on a level that still responds to the values and practices and what it means to remain dominant in the system. I think that's an important point. The reason I put that section in there is not to sort of, bash a thought process of that nature. It's just things that have gone berserk in that kind of community, and the kind of QAnon phenomenon. I had to respond to that, because so many people, as an aside, you go back to my first film, and they interpreted it in such an extreme way, not understanding what that film really meant. It wasn't about just secret society. It was never about secret societies or anything like that. But anyway, did I answer your question? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Hey, Peter.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, thanks. My question really is, in this great American experiment that we're all traversing through, and we're clearly beyond the point of one solution fixing the problem. In your opinion, with the looming prevalence of automation, what's the best that we could hope for with automation? 85% of jobs are going to be taken away in a decade. It's with COVID, we got to peer into the future with some universal income. If there was universal income, what's the best that we could hope for?
That's a good question. I wouldn't necessarily say universal basic income is the solution in the long term. I think it could help things as you try to readjust and adapt society, because we still have the same fundamental problems that even if you just give people money, particularly the lack of sustainability problems. That's the sad thing about the system, is the more material wealth people gain, it's all done by a destructive process as opposed to the ephemeralization process that I just mentioned. So it would be good to do it for short term to solve poverty. As far as technological unemployment, what's happening now with AI certainly is going to have an enormous impact. You think about it, universal basic income, if the state and the economy really wanted to save itself, they would do what was referenced by Keynes, and they would reduce the work week. But that's just not the way the thought process is here. That's really so logical that this system could save itself, not entirely, but in certain ways. they could say, well, all right, we got enough money, we're gonna reduce all the prices, we're gonna bring everything down, we're gonna lower the work, we're gonna pay people more, and boom, you still have the system. But there are countless other systemic forces within that that refuse to let that happen, or already would have happened, right? When you go back to universal basic income, that was an idea of Martin Luther King, 70 years ago. And, it's like, why hasn't it happened? And there's huge systemic reasons why it hasn't happened. I would go back to that basic end piece that I put forward. If you create a parallel economy with a community that actually focuses on the use of automation for efficiency and uses it entirely for that purpose, not for exploitation and scarcity, not to sell more things, then you're gonna see it start to build its edifices in that parallel system. But right now, it's still just gonna be used to destroy the planet, to push more consumption, to give the illusion, and all the things that I talked about that's leading the insidious growth economy. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, I have one more secondary question. At the internet the credits produced by Golden Trumbo.
Yeah.
I was wondering
You know that is you.
Oh, I absolutely do. The late great Golden Trumbo, the screenwriter.
Yeah, I just thought that was fun, because he's also produced the little short film, so I just thought that was cute.
I thought it was cute also.
Hello.
Hi. So most of your movie was, well, serious. So I was just wondering why you decided to put in the bit with the giant donut and whiteboard, because it was kind of just the whole movie, and I just love that touch. So why did you decide to put that in?
You said what? You said what movie? What'd you say?
So most of your movie was, well, like serious.
So you want to see why was it?
Yeah,
Did it feel
'cause-
jarring to you? Because I thought it was a good alleviation considering the nature
It
of
was,
the movie.
because like it was explaining exactly how you were fucked. But
Right.
they just really positive music in the background.
I enjoyed that concept just because I know how these documentaries unfold, and I don't like them to have that kind of straight, There's always something in all the films that I've done, and even my kind of series, speaking of that shirt you're wearing, From Culture in Decline, which is based on that same kind of feel, and I appreciate it. You gotta mix it up. You gotta mix it up.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Hey again. I have so many things I would love to say, but I'll try to keep this brief. One is I appreciated hearing the original marimba theme come back in this. That was awesome. I'm a marimbist. I was at a layover in an airport at one point, and there's this guy modeling this new technology where they can track where you are and show you your information or your advertising when you're within this certain perimeter. And he's trying to tell us about this, me and my buddy that were traveling, tell us about this amazing system and see if we'll sign up for it. I'm like, why would I sign up for this? I want them to market to me individually while I'm walking through the airport. And we got into this discussion about socialism and communism and the gulag and all of these things, all of the tropes that come up anytime you talk about changing the system. And then I asked him at one point, okay, if we have the ability to feed everyone in the world, should we? And he couldn't answer that question. Like, the propaganda is so deep. And I went from not understanding any of this, and then back in 2006, a friend of mine, or 2007, a friend of mine showed me the first Zeitgeist film, and I was like, whoa, this is interesting. But Zeitgeist Addendum was the one where it really got me thinking economically and just understanding debt and its equivalency to cash and et cetera, et cetera. So I spent the next 5 to 10 years really trying to wrap my mind around this, and understand it so well that I could explain it to other people. And then I realized that a lot of people, I don't know if they're incapable of understanding this, or if the propaganda is just so deep. And then I went through a period of just thinking that humanity is just doomed, or as the person before me said, fucked. And I don't know, I kind of lost all hope for a really long time. I visited Jacques Fresco, I met him the year before he died. I think it was 97 or 98. And I don't know, at this point, I see this film and it's so amazing, it's so inspiring. And the biggest question I have is, why do you still do this? Do you really have hope for humanity? Like in your most sincerest, honest opinion, do you disagree with Jacques Fresco that the only way to get there is through a huge, massive breakdown, revolution, lots of people are gonna die, the system's gonna collapse?
Well, going back to the gentleman, a few questions before you asked about the triggering or the ability to react to a great instability causing change. I would have to say, Jacques, I think his basic principles, right? I don't think that's the way that things would work. I think people get too acclimated. I think the power structure and people's worst instincts come out the more things get bad. Like, I think if you look at environmental breakdown, what's happening in the political systems around the world, the strain is starting to take hold. I really believe that figures, the more authoritarian figures, and Trump figures, they're coming out of the woodwork more so because people aren't really, they don't know what to do. When they're stressed, they move towards a kind of instinctual, towards a paternal thing. They want someone to be dominant. They feel they can hide behind someone dominant. I think that pattern is actually more strong than people actually awakening during times of great stress. So I don't really agree with that part. And answer to your question of why would I do this still, it's like, what else can you do in a way? You gotta do something. And I've often gone through patterns where just like you, why should I care? Why should I bother? I'll be off this planet soon enough to deal with what's actually coming because of what was explained in the film. But you kind of have to, if you have any humanity, you just feel like you have to do something. It's like, I go through those cycles, and even in this film, you hear the cynicalness, I put that in deliberately to give that sense, going, damn, he spits on the grave of humanity. Because that feeling is there, because you feel like everyone just has to be punished for the stupidity of what's happening. But at the same time, you recognize in compassion that we're all sort of products of this, and the people that suffer, the people that are agents of the system in the most blinded way, they weren't born that way. They were brought into it, and it's hard to break that. But so I feel you. It's hard to maintain optimism, but rather than say optimism, though, it's just kind of doing what you can. I'm not going to take it personally, frankly. If nothing happens, it's like you get cancer, you don't take it personally, right? It's like, all right, well, you just have to kind of be realistic about it, and if you have some will move forward, try to help. That's what I keep trying to do with these ones.
My last quick thought was just one thing that I've learned in my conversations with others is that the vision matters so much. You think of all of these great leaders in the Black Liberation Movement, which I've studied a little bit more than other movements. It's always about that vision. Martin Luther King had that vision that inspired so many people. So I love your visions, but as the person before me said, they are very serious and they're also very intellectual. And I'm just curious if, or maybe this is more of a suggestion, if you put out a series that was geared more towards this a simple vision, breaking this down in ways that even a 5-year-old can understand. Although 5-year-olds really understand this because they live in a resource-based economy with their parents.
It's a good point, yeah.
They're 18 and they're just tossed into the system.
Yeah, exactly. I'm making things accessible. I completely agree that kids are the easiest probably to communicate sustainable ideas to because it just makes sense to them. They haven't been cloaked and brainwashed by the overlay, the superimposed system that they take in terms of the structure. It's like Elon Musk that I alluded to. He's talking about population growth. So he's literally thinking in terms of the market. Like if people aren't born, the market system will not have the growth in that society, which is insanity to think that he's so dedicated to this system as opposed to life. And what it means to actually be sustainable, not forcing out new humans to continue the system. In fact, if you look at the entire society, it's basically a Ponzi scheme. Every layer of our society, even like the retirement system, like every country is based on these funneling systems that people pay into it. If new people aren't born, that's those systems for us. And of course, obviously, the less people are born, the less economic growth you have. And the system refuses to go backwards. You just can't adapt backwards. And it's just very toxic. Next. Hi. Hello.
So I actually start by saying thank you for everything that you've done over these past couple decades. I think you're one of the most underappreciated visionaries in our
That's enough.
world. But anyway, sorry. But my thing I want to ask you, do you think it's plausible that to the extent that the AI systems that are already in development by multiple different corporations that are all kind of in a race to dominate take off the strong AI, and I wonder to what extent you think that it's plausible that once those systems become sufficiently, they already are more complex than any human can even understand. I imagine there will be a point at which it will cease to really care what specific human inputs on a top-down level, like what I was colloquially referred to it as, like the machines stop taking orders from humans. And I'm curious to what extent that dynamic equilibrium of the steady state could be more effectively achieved once AI kind of, once we lose our grip, once humanity loses our grip over the development of those systems.
Well, it would, for AI to have the decision to do that, it would still have to have the input to see sustainability, I guess. But I think one thing that you do point out, I'm sorry, I'll say one thing I do point out is that all the companies now that are racing to do things for profitability purposes using AI is absolutely terrible. And military use, what's gonna happen, and this is an extremely good point about system evolution that I learned from Stanford here, is it was bad enough in like the 70s where the complexity of the economy was such that even, obviously even today, economists they can barely predict anything in their general field. But think about now. Now you have this overlay of these systems that are sort of self-aware, doing their own thing. And we have this exceptional digital reality. What's gonna happen when this becomes just increasingly more detached? I think what's gonna happen, it will happen that we're gonna reach a point where this impulsive need to keep engineering this efficiency for business is gonna go far beyond what we even understand. It's gonna be like looking at a car engine without having any idea, like not even a remote idea. And that's terrifying. The instability of a system that will be so complicated that it'll move away, and then trying to predict things like collapse, which once again, economists barely can do. I mean, you can get the rough estimate, but they still barely understand what's going to cause the boom, when the boom and bust phenomenon will happen. The causes are there, but they still barely can figure out what's going to happen. It's frightening looking at the sloppiness of what's happening with artificial intelligence right now. I'm horrified. Not because the AI is going to take us over and dominate us, but because we're not going to understand a damn thing that's happening in our ecosystem, through our systems.
Right, but it seems like you call it, like sort of define the human factor,
Right.
of like, that seems to be the stumbling block, the obstacle in between a sustainable, steady state economy. And so if the top level decision making, seems like those incentive structures that are built into the systems that are, as they're being developed by corporations, seems like those incentive structures within them could move towards a more sustainable allocation of resources.
I know what you're saying. I think I know what you're saying. I would argue, though, if you're talking about business incentives, absolutely not. That's everything backwards in what business, that's why that whole thing about growth, just reiterate that. There's nothing in the way that the world operates in terms of business that has any inkling of trying to be any degree of remotely sustainable. It just can't, it's evolved, that latent potential that you couldn't see 100 years ago has created this just outrageous system of consumption and development, and they can't stop it. And the culture is supporting it. We're automatons, most people, even people that are sort of self-aware, are still automatons of the system. And that's the most dangerous one. So thank you.